Welcome to our series on global challenges, pandemic and the world order. My name is Nicole Bibbins-Sidaka, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Master of Science in Foreign Service program. Our conversation today will focus on religion and the role of religious communities around the world. We have seen that the pandemic has impacted different faith groups around the world, and we'll explore the role that these religious communities play in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. We will have Dr. Katherine Marshall, a MSFS faculty member and senior fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, interviewing two experts. First, Azza Karam, the Secretary General of Religions for Peace, who also served as a former advisor on culture at the United Nations Population Fund and serves as the former chair of the United Nations Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development. Dr. Marshall also interviews Father Augusto Zampini, the Adjunct Secretary of the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development at the Vatican. I hope you enjoy our conversation.
Hello, this is Katherine Marshall, and I'm speaking with Dr. Azza Karam, who's sitting in New York at Religions for Peace. And we're going to be discussing religious communities and the COVID crisis, both the health crisis, the medical, the issues around health per se, but also the much broader crisis, up to and including the effect on social relationships, as well as conflict, discrimination, etc. So I'm going to ask Azza briefly to introduce herself and perhaps Religions for Peace. She's now the Secretary General. And then we'll move on to the COVID crisis.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much, Katherine, for the opportunity to have a chat with you on what we are all confronting at the moment in our line of work. Yes, my name is Azza Karam, and I serve as the Secretary General of Religions for Peace International. And what Religions for Peace is, it's the United Nations of Religions. We have all the religious communities and institutions of the world, including indigenous peoples, represented through their official structures and lines of representation. And we have also, like the UN, we have the international headquarters in New York and 90 interreligious councils in 90 countries and 6 regional interreligious councils. Each interreligious council is exactly the same. It has the national religious institutions and communities represented by their respective leaderships. The work that Religions for Peace has done since its inception has always been on peace writ large. So not only the sort of the cessation of armed conflict or hostilities, but peace as in dignity and well-being in every sense, in the holistic sense. So therefore, Religions for Peace effectively is committed to peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. Those are the 3 pillars of the work that Religions for Peace has been doing. And it comes out much more clearly, if you will, in language which is very synonymous with the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. So our new strategic plan that starts as of 2020 is very much in alignment with the SDG goals. Our key priorities are to make sure that the religious communities, through their institutions, are working together on issues of nurturing a sustainable environment. That's one of the key areas, but also, and this is very close to my heart also because of the fact that it was never quite spelled out before in interreligious work, gender equality. And again, in the language, in the intentions, even our indicators for our work come from the SDG space. So interreligious education under the education rubric is another one of our priorities. Obviously, building peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, which is the area that I think most of the long-established religious institutions and leaders within Religions for Peace have a habit. This is the normal habitus, the space of trying to build these kinds of societies. And now,
how have you seen the COVID crisis? How has that changed your life? When did you take up your position, and what has actually happened to Religions for Peace?
I formally took up the position in March of 2020. I had to wait until I got my work permit from the US government, and thank goodness it just came before the immigration services decided to, obviously also impacted by COVID, so there's a lot of issues there. So formally, as of the 1st of March, I've been in this position. COVID hit us all 2 weeks later, because then we actually had to have the lockdown was imposed here in New York. And if you remember, New York at that time was the epicenter in the US. And for the next few months, it remained the epicenter. I would say that the impact of COVID on Religions for Peace has been threefold. On the one hand, I think it's made us have to refocus all the priorities, all the other strategic priorities through the COVID imperative lens. You know, where we obviously can no longer convene the interreligious councils and have them work in their usual way, because even we aren't able to do our usual work. So that has required I wouldn't say backtracking, but a reviewing of what priorities are now going to have to be full center. And interestingly, building just, peaceful, and inclusive societies has been, which was one of the top 6 priorities, is obviously still extremely pertinent, because we realize that, and this is the second way in which Religions for Peace has been impacted, we realize that religious institutions have obviously themselves had to reconfigure their patterns of service, of work, to serve communities which are now facing something else entirely, loss of income, being forced to stay at home, higher incidences of gender-based violence, things which of course have been there, but this is now the here and now. So as the religious communities themselves were reconfiguring how they would function, even their own services were deeply impacted because people couldn't hold. So in the middle of religious communities configuring what they needed to now do, whether it was in terms of liturgy or in terms of services delivered to communities, Religions for Peace also had to, obviously, that had an impact on us too, to say, okay, well then how do we continue to insist that the services delivered continue in tandem, so that the Interreligious Council doesn't get forgotten as the Catholic and the Protestant and the Muslim and the Hindu and were now delivering more to their own, through their own work, to their own institutions. So we had to reconfigure, make the call again to say, well, remember, you still got this Interreligious Council, and that needs to deliver together. That has to continue to serve the same things your respective communities are doing, but you now need to do those together. And then the third way in which we somehow had to adjust our discourse, meaning not just language, but also actions, was in setting up a humanitarian, the very first multi-religious humanitarian fund, because of course, each religious community has its own, and is always the first responder in humanitarian disasters, but there was actually nothing there that was multi-religious humanitarian intervention. And if it was a global pandemic, we figured, well, a global pandemic means a global response, means a multi-religious coordinated response. So we set it up to further add to the resources of the interreligious communities who were working, our own interreligious councils, but also other actors who were keen on working with one another. So we needed to put our, so to speak, our money where our mouth was to help support that. Because again, you know, the Catholics will do what the Catholics have always done very well. The Protestants will do what they've always done very well. And we're trying to say, and work together. Yeah, so for some, it's an added burden, effectively. So we had to try to enable it. And so the fund is basically geared to provide the seed money for those who have the intention, the will and the intention of working together across the religious communities. And so that was a key thing that it wasn't on our mind at all pre-COVID, but COVID in a sense necessitated that kind of active support for multi-religious humanitarian response.
Now, obviously, religious communities are as diverse as humankind. We're talking about the world, many, many different societies. But I'm sure people have been asking you, as they've asked me, what is different about the way that religious communities have been affected within societies? Maybe if you could list a few of the distinctive ways, and the reactions you've been getting from other people, the questions you're asked about the religious response.
So I think folks who ask that question are unaware of two things. They're unaware of the spiritual service and symbolism that religious communities represent first and foremost. Yeah. So then they won't know that this is what people are actually now seeking more than they would have done before. And B, that these spiritual spaces are themselves undergoing a huge identity crisis, because the very basis on which they retain their raison d'etre is now being questioned. And you can't convene, you can't come together and provide a liturgy in the same way. And so there was this moment of trying to reconfigure what it is to be a church, what it is to be a mosque, what it is to have the temple, when people are not allowed in. So this was a massive seismic, I think, earthquake for the very, very basic purpose of all religious institutions, right? And it went, I think it somehow went relatively undetected, because of course every single entity flipped over backwards to reconfigure their abilities to serve. And of course, because we're based in the Western Hemisphere, and there is access to, there's access to internet and technology. So when these entities in the Western Hemisphere reconfigured to deliver their services through communication technology, we didn't see what was going on elsewhere in the world, where the earthquake continued, but we're not looking, because we're always looking through that Western prism in our mind. So I think that was that's one big thing that happened that isn't still not really seen enough, except through the Western lens, which is exceedingly limited.
Well, we're seeing some of the debates around what are essential services, with people objecting that liquor stores are open, but churches are not. That's been a debate. What about some of the very negative cases that we've heard about, the super spreaders, the churches that reject science? Our sense is that that's a very small minority, but I can't imagine that you're not getting a lot of questions about that. So I'm interested in your answer.
I'm getting a lot of questions about that from outside of the religious movements. I'm not getting questions about that from within the religious movement. I'm getting a certain amount of, I wish this wasn't happening. This such and such a pastor or such and such an imam are doing this, and we really wish it wasn't happening. But the questions are coming again from outside of this religious space, because the what happens among a minority that's so sensational obviously takes the whole attention of everybody else. And I think the issue here was to be able to come out together, which has happened. And that was the other thing we noticed. That's actually positive. That isn't negative. That we saw the religious leaders come together even more than before, wanting to make similar sets of statements together, endorsing statements together. So apparently it's a great deal easier to get a consensus around many of the statements. So COVID actually fast forwarded some collaborative statements at the level of statements, a lot more willingness to support as religious leaders, to support together. So when the UN Secretary General made the call for a ceasefire, a global ceasefire, the amount of unanimity of wanting to endorse this as religious leaders, including those from countries where indeed a ceasefire was much appreciated, was huge. It was massive. And we were the ones, as a secretariat, we were the ones asked we have to do this. You must make sure that we can put this message together. And the same thing started happening very systematically. There was a willingness, an immediate willingness to issue a statement saying something along the lines of, I think we all need to stick to the science here. And if the science says it's not a good idea to come together, that's what we should do. That's what we should do, because that's how we can become better, faithful people. Sort of more faithful is really just listen to how we can save one another, as opposed to what we can actively do to contribute to spreading the disease amongst one another, hoping that the Almighty will intervene. So that that is how it was responded to, in a sense. No, we must come together and have this very clearly stated and disseminated and endorsed. Also a tremendous zest to come out with guidelines for all the communities. The religious leaders themselves were doing so. At the same time, the WHO was trying to bring its there had already been at least 50 guidances issued from different religious communities and joint guidances issued, because they needed to make sure that they could issue the right guidance for their own faithful, so to speak. So
yeah.
So all of
Now,
this was actually very positive, I think.
Yeah. Through most of history, whenever you've had pandemics, there's been fear, but there's also been a tendency to look for someone to blame and to scapegoat. And in some cases, there are reports that this is focused on some religious communities. How have you seen that as a pattern, and what is being done to counter it?
So, to be honest, I think that I did not see amongst our communities, the interreligious communities, this phenomenon of scapegoating happen so frequently. It wasn't something that the interreligious space witnessed. It definitely happened, obviously, it's still happening, but it isn't a defining feature of the multi-religious engagement, which is one of the reasons why we're trying to support more multi-religious engagement vis-a-vis the COVID crisis, because that to me, that's like a space of mercy. Mm-hmm. Whereas when it's individualized religious communities or institutions behaving on their own, I think the space for mercy can sometimes be a little bit diminished. But that's just purely my reading of it. So we did not confront the in any sort of major way that caused concern this issue of scapegoating any particular religious community. We know it was happening. Some of our religious leaders or members were making noises, but at when they came together as a community of faith, as a multi-religious community of faith, that was not something on the agenda. That was not a main discourse in any way, shape, or form. Perhaps it's because there's also a sense of being ashamed to say something like this when you have everyone around you also listening to you, as opposed to your own community listening to you. That I think does play a role. I like to think of it, as I said, in terms of a bigger space for mercy between the different religious leaders. But I think that when there were noises, they tended to be at a national level, and these are causing a significant consternation at the national level between the different leaders, where they have these particular forms of scapegoating, where they are endorsed by governments or certain people in government. They were louder and more visible and more disconcerting. Mm-hmm. But where they were not endorsed, they didn't rise to prominence in any way, shape, or form. So you could actually really see where the political and the religious were having their particular forms of alignment for the good or for the bad in this case.
You mentioned in the beginning your focus, which is through your entire career, on the role of women and the role of women within religious communities, as well as in society. How are you seeing any change that's linked to the COVID crisis?
So I think COVID has done two very clear, completely opposite tendencies. On the one hand, the physics of the lockdown have led to very clear spikes in gender-based violence. That's a universal given. There's enough data on that. And this isn't just religious. This is from all women in all communities. But on the other hand, the exact opposite has happened, because I've always said from earlier research done even here in Religions for Peace that 90% of those providing services in communities, in religious communities, are women of faith. Yeah. So whether we see them or not is irrelevant, because we know that those who are actually running around doing the gathering and the putting and the setting and the organizing and the delivering and the sitting with people and so on, they're women of faith. So 90% of those delivering services actually are women of faith. So clearly, when this pandemic hit, everyone had to, all hands on deck, absolutely all hands on deck. So it meant that the usually segregated spaces that may have been there in certain communities, there was no room for segregation based on gender. There was segregation that is the socially distant thing, but all hands on board required all hands on board. So you could no longer say, well, you know, you're not going to be seen, you're not going to be visible, we don't need you, you can do this behind the scenes. No, all those who are serving had to be seen, acknowledged, spoken to, referenced, organized, and mobilized. And women of faith clearly as the first responders in the first responders spaces were very much visible, doing a whole host of things in communities. So I think that in a sense, I would say that COVID contributed to lifting the veil from how much women of faith were doing and are doing. So the veil is in a sense lifted. Everybody can now see much more clearly how it is that women of faith are at the front lines of the faith responses. And this is within religious institutions per se. It's also in religious NGOs who are affiliated to these, and it's in the community-based organizations where they come together because of their commitment to their faith traditions and so on. You could just see there was a lockdown, but those who are out there doing a lot of the work to keep things going, whether it's feeding or distributing food or distributing medicines or actively going and sitting with people, keeping the social distancing and whatever, but they were women, a lot of women. And those who were raising money for this effort in different religious communities are also women. So I think that's the other thing that happened, you know.
Would you say the same thing about youth?
Definitely. Absolutely. I think you've seen a lot of mobilization between and among and by youth groups. We in Religious Peace have been we feel very blessed by it, to be honest, because we have a massive interfaith youth network that's also regionally positioned and positioned within these interreligious councils at the national level. So we've seen them do remarkable things. We've seen them lead, take their own initiatives and lead on some of the interfaith work and the actual service delivery themselves. Plenty, in a way that I think shames some of us, because they've been much more brave than the elderly generation, shall we say.
We've heard two very different narratives during the crisis on the issues of conflict, wars, discrimination, social tensions. The first one is that the COVID crisis has highlighted our common humanity, that we're all in it together, that this will break some barriers of the polarization and the tension. The other one, which sadly is rather borne out by history, is that a pandemic like this one that affects people so profoundly will in many ways aggravate divisions and tensions. So I think all of us, and we're involved in an effort together on this to try to understand better what's happening, both with conflicts that started, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Myanmar, that started before the crisis, but also some that may be affected by the crisis. And since Religions for Peace is the expert on peace, I wondered how you see these different narratives and what is obviously a complex subject playing out in different ways. What is your sense of where things are and what is happening?
I think to be honest, I think that to assume that only one set of events was going to happen is not very realistic in the first place. I think what the state of fear that is created by a pandemic does anyway is it brings out the best and the worst in all of us, right? So individually, socially, nationally, and internationally, it really does bring out the best and the worst. And I think we're both in a country where you can see that at the level of policy making, you can see the narratives of the best and the narratives of the worst playing out, including within the same political establishment. So to assume that anything different would happen is not realistic. That means that we have seen those who, confronted by the fear, are actively listening, actively working together to maintain, if you will, that more healing collaborative space. And you will see those who are riding on the beast of the fear to continue to create and actually see an opportunity to rise more mighty as a result of this state of paralysis created by the fear amongst many, including in some cases governments. If you were in a non-state party trying to make a point, well, this is a great time actually, if that's your point, to gain attention for your plight, to capitalize on the fact that some of the troops that would normally be put together for looking after you to prevent you are actually now busy trying to do things such as actually delivering certain things for people. So this is a wonderful opportunity for those who wish to seize it, for the good or for the not so good. And I think you see that some of the non-state actors have themselves split between those who are saying, okay, we kind of need to maybe we just take a break here and see how we can look after the few people that we are supposed to be looking after, because this is what's the point, right? We have to make sure that we can at least attend to some of those very social needs, if you will, care needs. But then you see those who have ramped up their violence, actual violence, not only physical violence, but actual violence. Mm-hmm. So that's simply where you see the completely contradictory tendencies. And therefore, more than ever, those institutions which are supposed to be keeping the peace are more challenged than before. They're more challenged not only because there's a global pandemic and people have different working modalities and we don't know what's going to happen to the institutions. No, they're challenged because of this business of exploitation of the moment that is taking place by all parties, by all, governmental, non-governmental. So if you are already struggling to deal with X number of countries, like the United Nations, or to deal with X number of religious institutions, or to deal with X number of businesses, you now have to realize that these have split in different directions. Some are doing some amazing work and making themselves available to do more, to do better, etc. And some are actually just, causing even more disruption than they were before.
Now, you had mentioned before that the United Nations Secretary General had called for a global ceasefire. Have you seen discussion or responses specifically linked to that?
Yes, I know that many of our interreligious councils in DRC, in CAR, in some of the Middle Eastern contexts have been trying to hang on to that as an opportunity to have their own conversations in their own spaces, mm-hmm. and to try to indeed utilize that momentum to say, well, there's something more at hand here that we must build on this. And they haven't necessarily, in some cases, I think the more contentious the issues or the fight, the more contentious the struggles, the less it's because the Secretary General said, mm-hmm. and the more it's because, well, look here, this really is a pretty dire situation for everyone. We need to figure out what to do. But of course, the Secretary General's call is an impetus, right? But you may not want to use that as the rationale, because for a number of reasons, that may not be the most convincing argument in these deeply contentious spaces. But I think,
you've worked for many years with the United Nations. You were in UNFPA, but also have had roles in coordinating among them and have among agencies and have worked with the Office for Genocide Prevention and some of the issues around hate speech and so on. How have you seen that affected, that kind of work affected by the current crisis that we're living?
Well, for the first time in its, let's see, it was established in 2010. So let's say for the first time in the decade it was established, the UN Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development actually issued a statement, which, as you well know, for something to come from 20 different entities and be endorsed by 20 different executive offices isn't exactly very easy. But they managed to come out with a statement which was robust and quite impressive, in which they were decrying the absurdity of some of the conflicts and actually calling for and recognizing the very critical role that religious actors are playing and need to be enabled to play even more by the UN system itself. So it was the first time, I think, that this multi-UN entity, let's say UN system modality, actually felt compelled to recognize, to advocate, and to make the call for the UN system to be more cognizant of the value of the engagement of the religious communities in this pandemic space, and call for them, for the religious actors to work together to try to deal with the marginal voices that we were talking about earlier, in terms of those who wanted to congregate nevertheless, and so on and so forth. So I think there was a very positive statement in the statement, in making the statement. That in and of itself was a very positive statement. I also know that there's been a significant ramping up of engagement with faith-based actors and organizations within each of the different UN system entities. There isn't, I used to say this before, but it's even more the case now. The discourse in the UN had moved from should we engage to how to engage already. So this happened in my own, so to speak, lifetime inside the UN. And now I think it's so clear that there is no more margin of should we engage. Not at all. There may have been a few voices here and there in different settings, but it isn't the case. The only situation now is, yes, of course we must engage and partner and so on, but then the question is, yes, okay, and so are we going to put resources in this space? Now that's a different thing. That's a different thing. That takes us a step further. But I think if you will, we've now cemented this platform of we are engaging, we must engage. How do we engage? That's cemented. And then the question becomes, okay, next step is, you want to put your money where your mouth is? Help this work? No, that's maybe next. We may need some more time for.
Yeah. What about the hate speech issues specifically, and some of the really sore spots in the world where religious actors are so important?
I think you've seen where, especially in the UN Office of Prevention of Genocide, one of, I believe, Mr. Dieng's hopefully lasting legacies is that he himself, together with Mr. Khan from UNITAD, the UN mission in UNITAD, had taken already an active step to approach the religious leaders in Iraq and the religious communities in Iraq. And they came up with what I think is a historic statement, where the religious leaders come together to publicly call for restitution based on what happened under ISIS, Daesh, or the so-called Islamic State, to actually all of them in their different robes and orientations say this is something we need to address. There's been plenty harm done. This has to be redressed, etc., etc. And I think that statement, which had been just arrived at an agreement about before COVID, was celebrated after COVID, because there was a deeper sense of urgency to now really look at the needs of those who had suffered under Daesh because of the domino effects it was having across the Iraqi religious and political spectrum. So that to me was a very clear example of where the pandemic fast forwarded a process of multi-religious coming together for the healing and restitution purposes. I think you will note also that here in the United States, the pandemic seems to have fast-forwarded people's intention to address a ridiculous, long-lasting legacy of racism. It's been the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think is teaching all of us plenty, of course, has existed. That's the civil rights movement in this country, which I always uphold as an example for all. But you have to understand that I see that this has happened, that the pandemic era has added to the intensity of people's anger, resentment, but also willingness to listen, to see, to finally see what was there all the time, but for many reasons you did not see. And now you must see, right? And accept that there's plenty harm that is being done on a daily basis that is systemic and systematic. So the pandemic has given us that too. It has widened our eyes, lifted the veil from a tradition of not wanting to see, of being too busy, if you will, if you want to assume give them the benefit of the doubt, of just being too busy to notice. So this has happened systematically in so many other contexts. And where you see in Belarus an election that could have passed easily with yet again being manipulated. No, it's not going to pass. We will we will stand up. We will, in spite of the intensity of the repression, the legacy of resistance is in fact re-energized, if you will, insisted upon. And I see that as happening. It's not a coincidence that and by the way, we have a pandemic, and by the way, this is happening. No, it is because of what the pandemic is causing on a social level. If we are agreeing that there's a trauma that has happened because of the pandemic globally, then we also have to understand that this trauma leads to other things, and it's not all terribly bad. It's against that which is terrible. But the resistance and the building of resilience that comes with that resistance is extremely helpful and necessary and valuable for all of us.
I know that Religions for Peace is involved in many of the worst and most stubborn conflicts in the world. Just to take one example, with the Rohingya crisis and Myanmar, that's an area where there's been a major investment by Religions for Peace, investment in the sense of caring, organization, visits, etc. Has that been affected? How would you see that affected by the COVID crisis?
I think you'll see there the same things we're talking about, the two completely polarized directions in which things go. And with the Myanmar work in particular, I have to give a tremendous credit for the persistence of this engagement of Religions for Peace, the leaders of Religions for Peace. I have to give incredible credit to the religious leaders in Myanmar themselves, who have been determined to come to the same table with the military, with the government representatives, with each other, and therefore much credit has to go to the government of Norway, which has been very, very, I think, diligently and decently supporting that effort. And maintaining their support very strongly. And to our Japanese colleagues from Risho Kosekai, who have been extremely committed to everything Asia, but especially to these places where the tension and the pain is so intense. So I have to say that because there's so much that has been made possible as a result of these different partners coming together to collaborate with the not only assent but an acquiescence, but with the active participation of the religious leaders themselves, because it does take two to tango in this particular case. And I think what we've seen happen with COVID is, on the one hand, in the very beginning, when it was the fear was most intense, if you will, in a sense, also with the passage of time, some people become less fearful, and that tends to happen, and that's what we're all being warned against. And no, keep the precautions, be careful, etc. But you in the beginning, when it was very intense, when the fear was the most defining factor, we saw it. Obviously, you can't congregate, and the whole point of how far this conflict is being doctored internally has because of the willingness to come together around the same table. Yes, that's been central And in much of the religious peacemaking and peace building, this is the sine qua non, obviously. You know, you can't make the peace between warring parties if they're not going to come together. If they won't sit in the same room, forget it, right? And even more so when you're talking about the religious discourse, which demands that you must congregate and share from the same, cup even. That is the original language of most religious actors. So we saw a backtracking then of, okay, well, we're not going to be able to meet. Well, this isn't going to work then, is it? Well, and then the seeping in of the old discourse of othering and anger and the military taking certain decisions that they were kind of committed to not making. So you saw that slowly start to happen. But then I think you saw something amazing, which is that the religious leaders who had been part of this process, you saw their resilience in being determined not to backtrack. We've come together this far. We have borne so much insults, derision, disfavor, nastiness from within our communities, from within the different sectors we're working with, to come this far. No, we're not gonna walk away from this. This is not something we can walk away from. And so you see them struggle to stay the course, to stay talking to one another, to hold each other accountable to what they had agreed was absolutely the bare minimum, at least, that's necessary. So you see that happening, which is, to me, that's the sign that the process has been successful already. Quite apart from the outcome, at that moment when, in conflict studies and peace studies, we always say that there's that particular tipping point when you realize that these actors themselves are absolutely committed, and they are able to keep the people behind them, to keep their communities behind them, at least a certain, what do they call it, a critical mass of their communities behind them, because then they have to work even harder within their own communities. It's not just the determination to stay on that same table, but to make sure that their communities, at least a critical mass, is not going to go against them. So they've been having to work harder, but when you reach that moment, that is the tipping point. That's when you realize that things may not improve 100%. That ideal image that everyone is deeply committed to may never come to fruition. But the bare minimum that has been agreed to as absolutely necessary to keep us sane is what we will fight for, we are determined to keep, and that will stay, right? It doesn't mean that the Rohingya are now all of a sudden given their, no, I wish, but we still have a very serious issue. But the commitment to keep walking this process until you realize a better and a better and a better result is there. And that, to me, and I think to anyone who understands peace and conflict, is the most important ingredient.
This issue of dialogue is one that can be very frustrating, because I think many of us know that without that engagement and willingness to be transformed, you can't make progress. Mm-hmm. And yet, for many, it is really just blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Too much talk, not enough action. But let's turn a little bit to the future. Asking you to take a crystal ball. We talk about, the Secretary General talks about Build Back Better. I heard Michael Mueller the other day talking about Build Back Forward. The idea is looking beyond the conventional. Do you have, how do you see what's going to happen next? And how will it, of course, affect the religious communities?
So I think I often associate Build Back Better with Joe Biden and the electoral campaign here, and maybe that's because of where one is. But I think that this plague has made us have to, in a way, want to desperately hold on to Build Back Better and forward and more. Everything that could possibly help us survive this is very much looked forward to. I can see, again, two polarized tendencies within the religious communities and in the way that the religious communities themselves are engaging. I think we are seeing, and we're seeing this in Religions for Peace through the fruits coming out of the MultiReligious Humanitarian Fund. There's a ramping up of multi-religious action around this pandemic. It's bringing people more together. It's energizing the youth and the women of faith to do more creative things together with their religious leadership, with their communities, beautiful ideas that they're actually producing, just working together. So I see that, and it cannot but absolutely fill us with hope. It's incredible. You know, in the midst of the darkness, there's so many initiatives of light that people are rediscovering their spirituality. They are more affirmed in the service to one another, and so on and so forth. So the MultiReligious Humanitarian Fund lens is giving us an opportunity to see the sunshine, to see the warmth, the potential, the capacity, the building, definitely building. And you know that there are relationships and patterns of service that are being established that can only be good. At the same time, you also see, outside from the rosy lens of the MultiReligious Humanitarian Fund for Religions for Peace, you realize that not a single religious organization has actually agreed to come forward and to support this multi-religious fund effort. And when Religions for Peace set it up, we didn't set it up as Religions for Peace. We just said, we'll provide the work to help the coordination and the logistics and the whatever communication, but this isn't supposed to be Religions for Peace. This is, come on, just chip in kind, $2, I don't care, just chip in so that it's clear that we're all actually trying to endorse and support. And what was very clear to me, and still is the tendency to isolate oneself as an organization, as a religious identity. No, we have our own things. We have our own means, we have our own mechanisms, our own institutions. We're doing a lot, thank you very much, that we don't need this. We don't need to do this. We're already serving everybody. What would be the value? So this almost, I don't know if it's a willful or genuinely unconscious need to remain as a silo in your own thing, and not to see the value, and only see the complications that will result. That I see very clearly, and I think that spells, it doesn't augur well, because if it's really simple, if a pandemic can't get us to work together differently from how we're doing our usual everyday work, if a global pandemic isn't going to get us to change our mindsets and our methodologies of working, yes, this works. The logic of, well, this has always worked well, so why should I change it? That's the wrong logic, in my opinion. You know, if a global pandemic doesn't challenge that and make you decide, no, I can do better. I can and should change to do better. If the global pandemic doesn't cause us to do that, then quite frankly, nothing will. Nothing will, right? So, gee, we'll stay doing that which works fine from my perspective and my institutional perspective and my nation's perspective, and there you go, nothing has changed, right? So yeah, you see that too, very much. And I can see a deepening then of the religious tensions intra-community. You know, this is, yes, 10 of us, 10 different organizations, each serving all communities. That's grand, that's wonderful. But guess what? The intra-community tensions don't get addressed. Intra-community tensions, religious tensions, would be addressed only if you work together and you are seen to work, to serve, to want for one another together. Yes? If you are 10 serving the same communities, each of you separately, that doesn't address the intra-community, inter and intra-community tensions. It actually accentuates them. So that I can already see happening, especially between the large dominant religious communities globally and the dominant religious communities at the national level. There is a deepening of the me and the other discourse.
Azza, you began by comparing Religions for Peace to the United Nations, basically, that it's a United Nations or united communities of religions. And that raises the question of how religious bodies relate to the global order. The UN, the G20, national governments, regional governments, the European Union, ASEAN, SADC. How do you see that evolving? There have been some discussions that the relationships between governments and religious bodies have been tested and perhaps even changed by the requirements of the restrictions and the impact on the economy and so forth.
Mm.
But as you sort of look to the future, how do you see this global order question playing out?
So I think that traditionally there's always
It's
been
16 hours.
traditionally there's always been a love-hate relationship between the religious communities and political sectors, societies, whatever, institutions. There's been a love-hate relationship, and it, you know, history has witnessed different forms of this love and hate in different moments in time. So that's the usual. I think the usual is a love/hate relationship at different moments in time, sometimes at the same time, right? Now, I think what this has translated into, in terms of the multilateral institutions, is that the multilateral institutions also have adopted a very, for lack of a better word, a rather cautious approach towards the religious actors for a long time, and a very instrumental approach, which is now very much de rigueur. You know, how can we use them really? In it's not said badly intentioned, it's in a good sense. You know, how can we use them to distribute more humanitarian support to wider and bigger communities? How can we use them to hold accountable some of these civic society actors to their hold the leadership accountable and the governance systems accountable? So it's not always how can we use them to cause harm. No, it's how can we use them to do the job that the multilateral entities are actually created to try to safeguard and secure. But it's still an instrumental approach. So it's again, it's a classic approach where the religious actors and institutions feel that they should not be used or instrumentalized, but they should be co-equal decision makers in these different spaces. But hey, until such time as they're going to be co-equal decision makers, let's do our best to collaborate, okay? That's been the attitude from the religious spaces. It's a different tenor altogether when it comes to the multinational or the intergovernmental dealing with the multi-religious. There's a completely different pattern that then comes into play, where invariably the multi-religious is seeking to be that multilateral space for religions that can be walking in sync and support the multilateral objectives and missions. So Religions for Peace from its inception has its very first assembly was about human rights, sustainable development, and peace and security, the very same pillars of the United Nations system. And this is 50 years ago, because the understanding was and remains, how can we as multi-religious institutions work to support the multinational institution of governance? So there's an aspiration there that's very, very deep. For some religions, it's an aspiration to do good, to help be the conscience, the moral conscience of these political scoundrels, for lack of a better word, but also these institutions that really we all need, etc. But for some religious institutions, it's also because there's an instrumentalization there too, you know, to get more credibility perhaps, or to get more adherence, or to be seen as powerful, we must align with the politically and militarily powerful, right? So there's that too. Never spoken, never openly said, but obviously part of the relationship that's also historically there. I think what the multi-religious, again, enables is, whether it's because of the shaming factor of appearing too obvious, or whether it's because of the genuine goodwill that comes out when people come together to be better people in front of their creators. Whatever the reason, there is, I would say it's a bigger space of mercy. So it's still a space of mercy that wants to serve the multilateral governance, good governance space and agenda. Because they see that this is how we can keep the peace. This is effectively how we can keep the peace. If our governments are not at war with one another, we are less likely to be at war with one another as religious people, and we're less likely to be torn asunder within our own communities. So there is a very basic need for that too amongst those people. But what I am seeing happen is that precisely because the multilateral order is challenged, shall we say, to be very political. Yes, basically. there are multiple translations of that in the relationship with the multi-religious spaces. So there is a comfort, an increasing comfort of dealing with the religious institutions independently. This multi-religious is now more uncomfortable. You know, I know how the Catholic establishment looks and thinks. I can see the leader. I know there is let me, and they're important and etc. So let me work with them. I know how the Anglican communion works, and I get it. I know how this Muslim community or government usually very much affiliated. So I know how these work. So I'm seeing that whether intentionally or unintentionally, and frankly, it doesn't matter. But I'm seeing a certain schism that is politically inspired or induced or enacted by certain governments and multilateral entities, actually causing a rift inside the multi-religious space, because the willingness to work with the multi-religious is suspect, is still not a comfort zone. So as the multilateral establishment is struggling to keep a hold on the edge of that precipice, it's reaching for wherever it can reach. And right now, wherever it can reach is the individual religious institutions. You're not feeling comfortable enough to be gracious enough to look at the whole space. You're at the edge of that precipice, holding on with those hands. You're going to reach for the most easy to get, and the most easy to get is the individual religious institutions at best, and usually they are the Christian ones. So that is what is happening now, and you can begin to see that therefore those of us who are coming with a multi-religious message are finding it hard to get as much traction as, say, the Holy See or the Anglican Communion or Lambeth Palace would get. They would get far more traction in this space than those who are genuinely representing all the different religions of the world. So that's what I'm seeing happening. And that rift is not easy to maintain, because you need to be able to be acknowledged. Mm-hmm. For the multi-religious, there is a hunger and a quintessential, almost basic need to be acknowledged by the multinational. It's like a sine qua non. You and I are women, we see each other as women, we understand that we work. For the multi-religious, there is an existential need to be not only seen, but to be acknowledged and recognized by the multinational. And here we are endeavoring to go over all our differences, and the religious world is the best at making difference, at being different. I think the original architects of difference must have been religious in nature, right? So here's the world which excels at being different, doing its darnest to come together and systematically and repeatedly for the very same principles and objectives which these multinational are coming together. So, excuse me, why am I not getting the time of day despite having to do all this hard work, and you end up figuring that it's easier to just go to this institution or this institution? Well, I am this institution too, but I'm trying hard to be here too, right? So this dynamic isn't captured anywhere. And it's actually what I see happening exactly like a film unfolding in front of my eyes.
It's a very interesting analysis, and I think it explains in part why you want to encourage the interreligious responses during this COVID crisis, but also to make visible what is happening. And that is one of the constant complaints, I would say, or that the good that's being done is so rarely reported and so rarely focused on. Well, Azza, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating discussion, as always. Love talking to you, and I have many more questions, but I think we need to stop now because we've taken enough of your time, and you have, I'm sure, multiple crises. I've heard the pings going off through the conversation, each one probably a crisis from somewhere. So thank you so much, and we'll keep you posted on what happens with the course.
Inshallah. Thank you very much.
Inshallah.
Bye-bye.
So good morning. I'm Katherine Marshall. I'm in Washington, D.C., speaking from Georgetown University with Monsignor Augusto Zampini, who is at the Vatican, I believe. We're speaking in the context of the Global Symposium that Georgetown University, the School of Foreign Service, is organizing. So, Father Zampini, can you tell us how you see the COVID crisis, both the health crisis, but also the economic and social crises that are affecting everyone in the world in one way or another? How is that affecting religious communities? And then you might also just speak about the task force exercise that you are leading.
Thank you, Katherine. And yeah, the COVID is a tragedy. Let's start clarifying that. People have, I mean, thousands of people have died. There are millions infected, millions affected socially, economically, etc. So this is not a desirable situation. However, what the COVID crisis has done is to exacerbate other crises that we were having and we were not paying enough attention. I mean, of course, some academics or some specialists, yeah, but in terms of is that you cannot have a proper crisis and thinking, well, we might have to change something next year. No, a proper crisis is something that is urgent, no, that emerges in an urgent way and therefore requires urgent responses. Of course, urgencies, I like to put this idea, especially for those who are listening that are in the course at the university, the analogy of when we witness an accident on the street, no? So you have to run quickly and the tendencies, but you have to be careful, you have to think, because if you don't think, you can do more harm than good. And that's why all the courses for first aid help, etc. Well, this is something where all the people who are training in thinking needs to come on board, but not in the classic academic way of thinking in writing a book that it will be published in 10 years' time and somebody will read it. No, because people, countries, all leaders, they need to take decisions urgently. But and this is a new crisis, that is an urgent crisis that requires new responses. So here is the thinking. We need to bring our research and provide this research to those who have to take decisions now, so that they can take the best decisions they can. And this is very, very important. But it's not just a health issue, no? It's like, again, continuing with the analogy of the person who had an accident, is lying in the street. Well, it could be, the person could have also other diseases. You have to be careful in what medicines you apply. Well, the same, the world has a very, very serious, I would say, socioeconomic crisis. That is the ongoing inequality. This massive research on that, and it's obvious. So even if you don't believe in research, it's not to believe, but it's a fact. But you have just to witness how cities, for example, are built up. No, you have these very super extraordinary modern neighborhoods, rich, and next door a super poor one. And even in countries or in like the US, and even in cities like Washington DC. No, when last time I was in DC, I was impressed with the number of homeless, and I mean, it's not that you have to hide them, but I mean, we are talking about one of the richest economies in the world, and you still have this problem. So it's not just limited to poor regions. So inequalities is on the rise, has been on the rise for a while, and this is not just a coincidence. This is the consequences of a particular economic model. Again, we are not blaming or condemning economics as such, but we have to understand that within the economic model in general, the development economic model, the way we have created, over-emphasizing the need to grow materially, and considering the other things as externalities, as such as the world, the society. So this is completely insane. And the problem is that has created a big social inequality, which is totally unsustainable.
Mhm.
It has left millions of people behind, not just one, and it's not sustainable because that will implode sooner or later. And in the meantime, there are millions of people suffering. So this is not acceptable from a Catholic perspective.
Mhm.
So what's the alternative? Well, we don't exactly know, but we need to find out the alternative. And there's lots of initiatives.
Mhm.
So how to create a model of development to create job without destroying the society and without destroying also the environment. And this is synthesizes in 2 or 3 words in the book of Genesis 2:15,
Uh-huh.
when God entrusted human beings to till and keep the earth.
Mhm.
And the Pope explained this in Laudato Si. These 3, to till and keep, 3 words only. Till is to produce, to work the earth, no? But at the same time, you cannot produce, you cannot make it produce any production or work with the earth and destroy it. You have to keep, to protect it, to sustain it. See, these are the 2 things. And you can say not just the earth as the planet itself, but also the people who are in the planet, because we are part of the ecosystem. So you have to find out a way of developing a model of production that is not counterproductive to the earth that sustains that production or that permits that production, and to the people that produce it.
Mhm.
So this is what is at stake. Is the health crisis has exacerbated these 2 mega crises. So I would say are 3 more than 2. And the response, therefore, the urgent response to this crisis cannot omit the big mega crisis underpinning that. To use the words of the Pope that the Pope used recently, a tiny invisible virus has created a big mess. But we have to be careful that there are big, enormous, very visible viruses that are social inequality and environmental destruction, and created by us. So these 3 things needs to be addressed together, because they have the same root, that is the root of us conceiving us as dominators and tyrant dominators of the earth, that we can do whatever we want, and also a model of growth that is based only on a material conception of our humanity, which is only one part. And it's not sustainable, it's not cohesive with our deep roots as human beings, and it's taking us nowhere. So this emergency, the complexity of the crisis, and the novelty comes together. We need to respond fast, with taking into account the complexity, but simplifying it with novel things. That's very difficult, isn't it? Extremely difficult. That's why we need people who think, to support the decision makers who have to put in this soup all these 3 ingredients that are very, very difficult: the emergency, the complexity, and the novelty together. And they have to do it now, because they have to take decisions now. So, and what are we doing now? We are fighting against each other instead of finding this, how to create a very good soup that can cure the world rather than destroy it. I think that this is what, apologies for the long answer, but it's very important for me to set the tone of the conversation, because otherwise we talk just about COVID or another thing. No, this is a mega crisis that has to be resolved as it is, because otherwise it will be, in Spanish we would say, pan para hoy, hambre para mañana, which means, we have a bread for today, but we will starve tomorrow. No, so no, we have to address, and that's why the Pope says, prepare the future, bring the future back to the present, and think, what is the future where we like? Okay, what are the people that we need to get there, and what do we have to do? Because otherwise, we will keep repeating the same mistakes as the previous crisis, and we will have COVID-20, COVID-21, COVID-22, COVID-26, or more crises. And believe me, the environmental and social crisis will be even worse, and we won't have the world that we deserve and the world that we want to live for our children and grandchildren.
From where you're sitting, how have you seen the Catholic Church, which is a remarkable global community reacting? What kinds of information do you have? What are the themes that you see in the response? Then we can come back to the Vatican sitting where you are, but as a global community, both to the health crisis and to the economic and social crisis.
Yes, the church is, we have to remember, is part of the world. It's not outside the world. So therefore, the church is affected as everybody else is. Economically speaking, just to start with, the parishes during the lockdown, their finances were going down. Also, the lack of contact prevents. I mean, the church is basically means a gathering of people. So it has to be. They have to be reinvented. How do you do to continue the communion, but with social distances, etc. So the church is part of the world and therefore is affected as the world is affected. Now, but because our role is to serve people and to serve especially the poor and to create community, well, the local churches have been responding, especially, I mean, doing their best, especially in poor regions, no? Where millions of people have lost their jobs. If you think in poor regions, not just poor countries, no? But if you think about the majority of people in the world who are not rich, I'm not millionaires. Rich means, well, you can imagine. So rich are those who have to go out and look for the daily bread, look for the family. But all those people are in serious trouble today. So, of course, in some countries, there were some state help, or some companies, if they were employed, were keeping up. But there are others who don't have any state assistance or market assistance. And we're talking about millions of people. We're not talking about 5 or 4, even if they were 5 or 4, but here is a massive global problem. So the church has been trying to respond also to creating networks of helping those who have lost their jobs, helping the elderly people that they were on their own, that they were confined, that they couldn't see their family, lots of spiritual need there. Also people dying and the families couldn't attend their funerals. That's for me, it's very, very moving, that thing. No? And I have a friend who died and nobody could attend the funeral, and he died and he just disappeared. You see, so the church is trying to help on these things, you know, and trying also to create novel ways of responding to these challenges. So, but massive help in poor regions of the world, particularly through the network of Caritas and other networks, not just Caritas, but basically through the network of Caritas that is very big. And then from the Vatican, we are helping the network of Caritas also we're trying to strengthen a little bit with donations that comes to the Pope, and then we are distributing through the local churches in order to strengthen their projects that they have. And so this is one particular group of the Vatican COVID Commission, to strengthen these networks or the responses of local churches and to learn from them. No? We listen to them, we listen to the bishops, we listen to the hospitals, we listen to what they are doing, and we try to feed back based on our research, because also we have a think tank group that analyzes this from an economic, ecological, health and security perspective. So this is basically what we do. And another response, I would say, is from the Universal Church, also the link with international organizations and countries, particularly through the Secretary of State of the Vatican, that is a small state, but nevertheless a state. So we are also in touch with them to help, to listen and to feedback in terms of the decisions, because we don't want them to go back to normal. If normal was unfair and sustainable, why should we go back to normal? We want to create something new. Sometimes it's not easy. So, and also to communicate things. So in these areas of local churches, global research and integral research, global communication and link with international organizations and states, these are basically the way we are responding.
Could you describe the task force exercise that you're so involved in? It's an ambitious, and I think it has no real precedent that I'm aware of in any other community, religious or non-religious. So it would be interesting to know how it came about and what the basic parameters are.
Yes. So the story is interesting because the story is when we were deciding, well, the Pope has called us to create this task force, and he puts the Dicastery, that is like a ministry, for those who don't know, of integral human development, as the coordinator of the task force. But other dicasteries are involved, the Dicastery of Communication, the Secretary of State, Caritas Internationalis, the Pontifical Academies of Sciences of Life. I mean, there are lots of people involved, no? Local. But when he created this, he said he especially encouraged us to prepare the future, or to encourage, he said, with new imagination, but with the new imagination of the possible that only the gospel can give. What does it mean? Well, normally the reaction to when you want to create something new is, oh, we have to be realistic. Well, what does it mean to be realistic? I mean, realistic is, well, we can't do anything. So the Pope said, well, use the imagination with the realism that the gospel can provide. That is, the kingdom of God is here, and we just have to expand it. So that's real, that's possible. And the commission serves as a catalyst. No, we are not going to serve the world, but it's a catalyst, inviting people to the conversation, providing expertise and tools, listening to, and long-term change. And because we don't have any hidden agenda, we really want to change the world, to take this crisis as an opportunity to change the world. So I think that's the key for it works. And we have working group one that is about local churches. We explained that some minutes ago. We have the communications, we have the link with international organizations and states. And then there are working group two, it has 4 task forces on economics, on ecology, on health, and security. They all address these issues integrally, no? And connected and interconnected. And they all have organizations and people, movements that are Catholics and non-Catholic, no? That are, I mean, parts of the commission, parts of the reflection. And then we publish some things in the Vatican COVID Commission website. That is, you can just Google it and appears. But most importantly, we are providing food for thought for the church and also for the world. And we are pleased. Some of are very useful for some people. Find this very useful. I was surprised, for example, last week we are part of the World Economic Forum also task force, and they have included a lot of our recommendations that are coming from the Catholic Church, not in the pious wording, but they have heard and they have included a lot. And also now we are working with people who are working on the vaccine. We're working from people who are working on security, and we are working with the FIO and other programs on food, because we will have some programs on food in the years to come, unfortunately. We are working also with the design of new urbanisms and the creation of jobs. That's a very important thing. The new structures, the social systems and the relationship with nature, millions and millions of things that are happening.
What about education?
Well, education, of course, but the problem of education is the reason I didn't mention the word is because we don't want to confine education to the formal education, schools and universities, because this is already in Laudato Si, no? We need an education capable of triggering people's imagination and helping people to have a critical examination of reality. And formal education is very important, but it's not enough. We need education understood in a wider sense. And in that sense, of course, we are working on a program of changing the way we teach economics and finance and business. And we will start soon, I think, a pilot project with Fordham University. We are working in the way also we teach health and we conceive the public health systems and governance as well. Well, Georgetown University is, of course, a very strong member of the task force and of all the task forces. And just as a clarification for your students as well, that the entire university, not just one faculty. So they have been very, very actively involved. But again, not just from a formal perspective of what are we going to teach at the university, but how we conceive education. Because your question reminds me, we want to embrace hope for the human family, and there are two arms that we need for that. One is the education one, and another is spirituality. Because with that, we cannot ensure what we call the intergenerational justice. No, if we continue training our people to grow, to conceive economics as material growth at any cost, at any expense, we are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. If we continue to training people in governance as classic, governmental relationship without understanding what's going on now, that is, we will have a new world. Geopolitics is changing very, very fast. So we need people that can see beyond the current geopolitics to promote the new universal governance that we need. If we continue to treat people who are studying natural sciences only to completely detached from human beings, we are part of the problem and not of the solution, you see? So this is one thing, but the other is the spiritual one. The spiritual one is the driver for actual change. And the change that we need is so big that we cannot change without a very, very deep motivation. And motivation doesn't come from here. So education normally is conceived as a kind of intellectual thing, whereas spirituality comes from here, no? From your guts, from your, and if we don't have that, we cannot ensure that this is a sustainable change that we need. We need to start changing now. We cannot change in an overnight. We need to start, the conversion is a process, a journey, and the spiritual driver is extremely important. That's why, even in the United Nations, we have never been called and taken into account so much as now, because everybody understands that we need to bring our spirituality, all religions, to provide the spiritual driver so that this change can happen, because 80% of the people in the world declare to be spiritual. So if we bring the best spirituality out of each person and out of each community and organization, then change is possible. Otherwise, it will be very, very tough. But the same with education. If we don't invest in the future generations in a good education so as to address the current problems of the crises, as you mentioned, well, we are wasting our time. So these are the two arms for the intergenerational justice, and to ensure that the changes that we start now, hopefully now, will continue and will be deepened in the future.
So you are very much involved in this ambitious set of task forces and working groups. Do they have an end point, or is this a continuing effort? Do you foresee a product of some kind, a formal way in which it will be discussed and acted upon, or is there a different concept of this in this extraordinary time?
Well, there are some things that remain, the tradition, and there are some things new. No? So you have to keep all change. You have to keep the best of the past. So there are some things already happening through the website. We have already two ebooks published from what the Pope has said during Lent and during his messages and other things. Then we have our executive summaries on the web that they will be distributed also in a kind more of church language to the local churches that are acting upon them. We have more research coming up in different themes, such as the future of work, the common good and economics, peace and building and new solidarity, and social systems and the relationship with the earth. there's more things coming up. The Pope will address the United Nations General Assembly in 2 weeks' time. And then we have the new encyclical has been announced for the 4th of October. It is related to that. So all those things are more classic, they're concrete products. What is not so classic is that that at the end of the COVID Commission, fingers crossed, we found a solution for the COVID, but not for the other things, because the other things are more difficult. The end of the COVID Commission will match with the end of the Laudato Si year for spring of next year, although those who are not in the Northern Hemisphere for May of next year, 2021. And so that will be a starting point of what we call the Laudato Si 7-year commitment plan, or the Laudato Si, or the Jubilee for the Earth, as Pope Francis said last week, or the Laudato Si commitment plan. What does it mean? It means that we will start, we are already started, but it will be a movement, and will be also the outcome a bit of the commission, of people who really are committed to change. Of course, because you cannot change in an overnight, you have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years to change. So if you want to change your business, here's what you have to do. And by the way, here is good practices of all these companies, big, small, and large, who are already doing it from the north and the south. If you want to change your investments, here is what new investments is about, impact investing, positive social and environmental impact. If you want to change your parish, how to transform into a sustainable, carbon neutral parish, receiving the energy from heaven, as they say, and not from hell, creating new social bonds and new ways of communion. Well, this is what you have to do in your building, with your community, possibilities. And these are thousands of parishes all over the world who are doing. If you want to change your schools, this is what thousands of schools in India are doing. If you want to change your university, well, it's not very simple, because you have to change your curricula, your campus, your energy supply, everything. It's very difficult. So these are the years you have to do. And by the way, this is an example. Georgetown University is an example. No, that will be a total carbon neutral, well, quite soon. So, but we will provide all the expertise so that they can take the expertise and others can follow. And also the challenges, not just expertise. These are the difficulties, no? It's like if you want to change also your lifestyle, or your holidays, or your house. Well, these are already, some families are already doing this. So in a way, and we are doing this with millions of people from the Catholic Church, millions of people from other Christian churches. The Anglican Church is quite excited with all, and the Lutheran Church as well, and other Christian churches, other religions, and people of goodwill. So the idea is that we will arrive in May next year with this initiative of how to till and keep, how to allow the earth, our Mother Earth, to breathe, so that we as society can also breathe and create new things. And it will be a massive movement of people, that's from below, but also from above, because we are working on new regulations that can accompany this. Regulations from the church, regulations from local cities. Cities are quite involved in this. Regulations from countries, regulations from international organizations. So, but what we wanted to say here, we want to change. We are committed to that, and we are going to change, with or without you. With is better because we can support you. But if you don't go in this path, unfortunately, we won't be able to support you, regardless of whether you are from the right, from the left, from the north, from the south. No, because this has now colors. This is about humanity, because this is because within this change, it's not as straightforward. We need to discuss, but within this change, with path, not the path that belongs to the past, a path that belongs to a sick economy, with sick institutions, and with sick people. No, that's not what we want. The path that has healthy people with healthy institutions and healthy economics, this is the path. Of course, it's not as simple as that. We need to discuss how, the steps, where we go. this is the discussion that is worth having, especially in politics, Politics, as you remember what Pope Francis said in Laudato Si, politics is one of the highest expressions of charity, of love. Yes, love is political because we are political beings. It's no, as the ancient Greeks used to say. So we need to deploy our love in our society, and we cannot. We have to ask people to get more involved in politics, because politics is the one who is going to help us in going in this path. Of course, with the driver of spirituality. Of course, with a healthy economics, of course with a good public health system, of course with good intellectuals and good education. But without politics, it's very difficult. So in a way, what we are trying to do to end up, the Commission will end up with the COVID crisis will finish. It will be 1 year-ish, 1 year or two, but then it will start with this commitment for change, because the Pope asked us, please be concrete. I mean, stop talking and start helping people to do the actual change, which while you're trying to do that, is as you are a person, an individual. When you try to do something, change something of your own, you make mistakes. No, you have to go backwards and forwards and correct. Well, so we have to start now. Not that people haven't started, but we need to scale it up. The change that we need to scale it up, and we need to speed it up. So this is what the Commission is up to.
So the Commission is really merging, as you describe it, with a very broad vision, particularly as articulated in Laudato Si, but as the specific dimensions are coming out of the crisis. Looking a little bit closer in, two events are coming rapidly, and I'm interested in how the thinking that the Commission is doing relates. The first, the speech to the United Nations, I would imagine the issues of conflict and the call for a ceasefire, the issues of tensions, discrimination, which we've seen in too many parts of the world. So that's one set of issues. And then you have the World Bank, IMF annual meetings and the G20 events, which are focused more on some of the immediate financial packages, including, I would add, the issues of accountability. So perhaps you could comment briefly on those two dimensions of the issue.
Very briefly, well, for the Pope, because it's very soon, so we have to wait to see what he wants to say. But yes, of course, the Church has been saying for a while that we need, of course, we are in favor of multilateralism in a global world. You cannot, but there are lots of things that need to be changed also in the model that we have now, that was created, in the middle of the last century, and lots of things have changed, and particularly the issues of power. If you want to create a healthy global village, well, yes, of course, the powerful, they always will have a say, but a proper United Nations united, that can enable us to level a little bit. Well, this is something important, in the kind of the world order and global governance, especially in a world where private companies have more power than nation states. So the global order now is quite important. So, but yeah, and also the peace building. We cannot do all these things that we want to do without proper peace. And peace is not just the absence of conflict; it's a particular attitude towards the other and towards nature. So yes, but we have to wait just a couple of weeks to what the Pope is going to say. But that will be important. But in terms of in the short term decisions of the G20, IMF, and World Bank. Yes, the thing is this. We know, Katherine, that the decisions that governments are taking now will have a special effect in the long-term future, because that's what happens when you're emerging from a crisis. So we don't want the nations or financial institutions to take decisions that they don't have this long-term view in mind. Even if they have to take a decision for the short term, because what happens in the next years will really have an impact on the long term. So this is what we are trying to help them in a way, in terms of debt, and, the notion of debt, the notion of debit and credit, the notion of debt release, in terms of investment in public health. Look at all the countries, the problems that all the countries they have had because of the divestment from public health institutions. All of them. Or those who invest a little bit more, they were better off. So this is something that we have to, the importance of the World Health Organization, with all the problems that could have as any organization, but we are in a time, because of the issues of climate, that health and the destruction of biodiversity, or that health issues, we need a coordination somehow of health issues, and it's related to economics. It's not just, okay, you see, it's related to investment in prevention, investment in well-being, and investment on public health systems. And normally this is a mix, no? Normally it's a blend of private and public capital. So why are the benefits just for some private sector, some members of the private sector, and not, if the public sector is involved, it should be more public. The effect should be more, the benefits should be more for the public. So this is something that also has to be discussed, even in the short-term solutions, the rescue packages, that they have to discuss that. Well, this is something I want to stress because out very, very strongly, I would say. Why are we rescuing companies that are polluting and causing more problem? Why are we rescuing companies that are not rescuing their own workers? Is it not insane? If I, with the public money, I'm rescuing you, it's like the parable in the Bible. If I'm forgiving you or rescuing you, I expect you to, I'm not going to effect, I expect you to rescue your own. And if you don't, well, then I'm not rescuing you. This is the condition. The same with the companies that pollute. Okay, I can, in France, there were some things going on about this. Well, I'm rescuing you if you invest all this money in the transition that you need to stop polluting. But you see, this is forward thinking. I'm not saying that we don't have to invest in any company, but the governments now, they have a very, very soft, and even the International Monetary Fund, and with all these loans, they have a very big responsibility, enormous responsibility, because they are the ones who have the conditions. They shouldn't be the conditions that were put in the 90s that were a disaster, you remember, for some countries. The conditions should be how to do this transition for the countries or companies to implement the Sustainable Development Goals that we need, or the transition that I was thinking about, no? or nurturing the earth while we work the earth, of creating a new understanding of living together with new ways of energy, of public transport, of health. This is, I cannot do it myself, or the church cannot do it, or one country, we need to do it together. So the investment on this is an opportunity now, because we have all this money and it has to be put in rescuing not what it was, again, polluting, unfair, and sustainable. We need to invest in the transition, in something that is in health, in something that is new for the future and is sustainable for the future. The same in buildings and constructions, no? For just to say another industry. Well, we need to change a lot the way we conceive our buildings in general, because the world is becoming more urban, and will be by 2050, 80% of the world might be urban. But so the way we conceive urbanization, and we construct buildings, and therefore we conceive the food to feed all the people who are living in cities, the energy that we need. Well, we cannot have the same system that we have now, because it's impossible. utterly impossible. So this is the time to start thinking in a very sophisticated investment so as to allow the transition to happen in the next years, not in the next decade, in the next years.
Mhm.
And this is what we want. We won't stop. I mean, we would like to convince them, and we have to help also all these institutions that you mentioned, all the powerful people in the world, the G20, in IMF and World Bank, and to have this thinking, because at the end of the day, if we keep investing in the old things, or if we keep designing the world governance as we have, we will not be able to emerge different from this crisis. And he's repeating this every week. From a crisis, you don't get out as the same person. From a crisis, you emerge differently, even better or worse. So what do we want to choose? So that I rest my case.
You have given a gold mine of both information and inspiration. One last question. During this crisis, I think the vast majority of religious communities have been cooperative, have been part of the effort to find solutions to support the vulnerable people in society. But there have also been tensions between religious institutions and governments, including court cases and even some violence. So a very last question, do you see in coming out of this period of extraordinary global crisis, any changes in the relationship between religious institutions and states and societies? A big question, but with some quite specific questions as to whether you see change.
The change is in the same line as saying we won't be the same, especially if the church, if we members of the church, if we fulfill our mission, which is now is the time to be prophetic. Prophetic is not just to announce, but it's prophetic is being a strong message for the betterment of the people, no? For the what we call the expansion of the kingdom of God, of justice, of peace, of mercy, of care. And again, this cannot happen by changing some little things and tweaking some things here and there. It will happen if we transform our lifestyles, our companies, our nations. And if the church starts proposing radical transformation or conversion, of this ecological conversion, that will create tensions, of course. But the tensions are welcome. The problem is how to solve the tensions. And that will depend on the region, on the particular state, but it is time for the church. I mean, we are doing that already, and not just the Catholic Church, but the other Christian churches as well. And I think we cannot remain indifferent for this mega crisis that we are experiencing, that is affecting the poor, is affecting the earth, and is affecting everyone, the most vulnerable, the elderly people. I mean, healthcare work. I mean, we cannot remain indifferent. But because we are affected, so also as a church, now it is time, to speak out. How? Well, it depends. But you can, even if you speak out very polite and respectfully, you can be prophetic. And when you are prophetic and when you start saying things that are uncomfortable, you might be criticized. The alternative is to say that everything is fine and we will, and to support governments that are saying that. Well, I think people will be able to judge those religious leaders that are doing that, or those communities. But communities are keen on changing, and I think this will create tensions. But tensions doesn't mean necessarily conflicts. No, could end up in conflicts. But I think it's not just with governments. I think are with power in general, because people in power normally they don't want to change, and we are talking about radical change. So how to convince people in power that they have even a greater responsibility than the rest, and the power is service. For the gospel, power is service. For Christ, power was service. He was God, and even no, this is he didn't take being. He didn't take being God as a way of imposing his vision over others, but serving even the last ones and giving his life for everyone. This is our conception of power, and we have also to change a lot of things. But this is where we start. When you start talking about this, many people are uncomfortable, and there will be a trade-off, of course. So it's not going to be easy. But what is the alternative? That's the point. There's no alternative. So we don't have any other option but to be prophetic in the name of love, in the name of hope also, and in the name of our faith.
That's remarkable, and you focused very much on the prophetic role of the church, and I think you would say of the best of religion and religious tradition globally as very much part of the crisis. So thank you so much. I'm very grateful, and leave you to the rest of the day. So thank you very much.
Two interesting conversations about the role of religion and religious communities in a time of COVID. A couple thoughts as we begin our conversation. The role of women. Women have been unquestionably disproportionately impacted by COVID with the increase of gender-based violence as individuals and families and communities have had to live more closely together in this time of the pandemic. But also the role of women and the role of particularly of women of faith who have been an engine behind the services and outreach during these times. It will be important for us to watch how the role of women in individual communities evolve following the pandemic. Secondly, we have seen more multi-religious collaboration because of COVID. We've seen religious communities that serve in those who are most vulnerable in their community. Those communities come together and serve side by side. And this provides a platform to have significantly more multi-religious engagement. It will be important to watch whether this then becomes a platform for different religious groups to collaborate with each other on other problems following the COVID pandemic, and whether this opens opportunities for collaboration that did not exist before. I hope you'll enjoy the conversation.